All right. So welcome to Bird Book Club. My name is Alex Drost. I'm the communications manager for Environment for the Americas. And we are an online monthly book club where we meet with authors and activists and readers across the world to join in discussion and learn more about conservation, birds, and the habitats and resources that they rely on. So just a quick reminder to please keep your microphones muted during the session. If you have any questions, feel free to post them into the chat and we will bring them into the discussion during the Q&A section. This will be recorded and posted on the Environment for the Americas YouTube channel for those of you that need to leave early or if you would like to rewatch after the meeting has concluded. And so this is brought to you by Environment for the Americas. We are a nonprofit organization based out of Boulder, Colorado. And we work to connect people to nature, and we protect the environment through research, education, and partnerships across borders and across the Americas for bird conservation and wildlife conservation. We are the home for World Migratory Bird Day, which is our cornerstone conservation campaign. And it is an education campaign that creates materials and events to celebrate migratory birds and to raise awareness about the challenges that they face so that we can protect their migration routes across the Americas and across the world. We also offer internship programs for underrepresented early career professionals through partnerships in the U.S. Forest Service, the National Park Service, U.S. Fish and Wildlife, and Bureau of Land Management. And we do this to inspire the next generation of conservationists and to make sure that diverse voices, backgrounds, and worldviews are included in the field of conservation and in our future. You can support us by donating or finding out more information online at environmentforamericas.org. You can also get involved through volunteer work, or we also have a nice online store where you can buy all kinds of bird-themed gifts or books like today's book. Our next Bird Club book session will be on Thursday, August 29th, where we will be reading Birds Through Indigenous Eyes, Native Perspectives on Birds of the Eastern Woodlands by Dennis Gaffin. And the registration for that book club will open up right after today's book club has concluded. And so today's book club will begin with a short presentation by Steve, and then we will open it up for a Q&A session after that. You could post all of your questions into the chat where we will field them and bring them into the conversation. And once again, please remember to keep your microphones muted during this session. Okay, so that brings us to the beginning of book club. And this month we are discussing Alien Worlds, How Insects Conquered the Earth and Why Their Fate Will Determine Our Future by Steve Nicholls. And it's a collection of beautiful insect photos and science writing that is very accessible and covers a wide range of topics on the diversity and abundance of and the history of insects. And it's a way that insects understand the world, but also our connections to them as human beings and maintaining a healthy biosphere and a healthy environment. And we chose this book because our theme for World Migratory Bird Day this year is insects and protect insects to protect birds. And so we're really happy to have an expert talk to us about the importance of insects. So today's author is Steve Nicholls. He's an Emmy-winning producer and director of acclaimed wildlife documentaries such as Appalachia, The Endless Forest. He's a fellow of the Royal Entomological Society and the author of many books, including Flowers of the Field, A Secret History of Meadow, Moor, and Wood, and Paradise Found, Nature in America at the Time of Discovery. So thank you, Steve, and welcome, and I will turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Alex, and thank you for inviting a bug man into the heart of your bird world. But as Alex said, the two groups of animals are intimately related, and some of the biggest problems that birds are facing both in America and over here in Britain, where I'm based, are faced by the insectivorous birds, because insect populations have declined so much, and it's really scary to see in some ways how much insect populations have declined. But I thought before we get into the discussion session, which I'm really looking forward to, I thought I'd just give you a bit of a very quick overview, firstly of me and who I am and what I've been getting up to, and then secondly why I felt I needed to write this book, and also to some extent a very brief sense of what the book is about and what it's trying to do. So let me, if all goes according to plan, I will share my screen and we will see if we can discover a PowerPoint, which seems to be there. Excellent. So far so good for my gross incompetence at this, so that's great. Is the slideshow gone now? There it is. Good. So my background, so I was an academic entomologist for a while. I worked at the University of Bristol, which is my hometown here in the southwest of England, working on dragonflies and damselflies, which are kind of primitive groups of insects, but they have a lot to teach us about where insects came from and you know, how they got to be sort of where they are. But I very quickly shifted out of that because the world famous BBC Net unit is just about 200 yards away from the university. So I was kind of seduced by the dark side and went over that. So for the last 40 or so years now, actually, I've been making wildlife documentaries around the world. And that's been a fantastic privilege, because what it means is I've traveled all over the planet and worked with scientists and met with scientists and land managers and conservationists all over the place. And they've all been unfailingly gracious in sharing their work and their knowledge, you know, for our films, but of course, you know, with me as well. I've always tried to make, where I can, films about insects or, you know, bugs in general, because they're kind of underrepresented on TV, and it's quite hard because most broadcasters prefer the big furry stuff. I mean, even birds are hard to get films commissioned of because, you know, they're not big and furry and they don't hunt wildebeest on the Serengeti. But but insects are, if anything, even harder. But I have succeeded over the years in making quite a lot of insect films based on the knowledge shared by, you know, scientists from around the world. We're in discussion at the moment with Nova on PBS to do a film about insects, but you know, it's a hard negotiation because we have to keep convincing the executives that, you know, insects are kind of cool and they're, you know, do interesting things, and okay, they don't have fur and they don't roar, but you know, they do a lot of other amazing things. Whether we'll finally get the commission, I don't know. It's a familiar story over the 4 decades I've been doing this, but we have done quite a lot. And the latest one, just in case anyone's interested, this was released about 2 years ago, Planet Insect. It's a 3-part series for Curiosity Stream, which is a DC-based streamer, which looks at the kind of why insects have been so successful, why there are so many of them, why they're so diverse. In other words, the kind of subject matter that the Alien World book is about. And in making this film, or in writing the original proposals for this film, I realized that there was such a lot of information about this, and it was such a big story, that there's no way that we can squeeze all of that into a 3-part TV series. I mean, we squeezed quite a lot of it into the 3-part TV series, but not everything. So I thought, no, this has got to be a book. And as Alex said, I've written quite a few books in the past, and I'm working on new ones at the moment. So it's been like a part of my career. So that's where Alien Worlds, the book, came from, and it sort of, I wanted to sort of explore why insects are so important. Why, for example, that you need to, you know, conserve insects to conserve birds, because they are linchpins of the environment, basically. And this place here, this tells you a lot about, you know, both the diversity and abundance of insects. This is the Maguire Center for Lepidoptera and Biodiversity at the University of Florida in Gainesville, and it's a centre largely dedicated to the study of butterflies and moths, which still means that this place is full of millions of specimens and countless species. It's a kind of place where you can really get a sense of how abundant and diverse insects are, and that's just one group. So what I wanted to do in the Alien Worlds book was to explore the reasons behind the success of insects. And by success, I mean their diversity and their abundance. So in terms of diversity, we've described about 1.5 million species of animals on the planet. 10,000 of those, or well, depends who you classification you look at, about 10,000 of those are birds. 1 million of those are insects. So 2/3 of everything we've described in museums and universities is insects. So they are extraordinarily successful in terms of diversity. And that's one of the things I wanted to look at. But here comes something interesting. 1 million species, and yet out of the 30 or so orders of insects, the kind of broad different kinds of insects, there's only 5 which are really incredibly diverse and numerous. And that's the beetles, the Coleoptera, the Lepidoptera, the butterflies and moths, the Hymenoptera, which are the ants, bees and wasps, the Dipterans, which are the flies, and the Hemipterans, which are the true bugs and cicadas and stuff like that. These are the big 5 out of 30, more than 30 insect orders. So here's something interesting. Basically, by looking at these creatures and then looking at other insects, we can begin to try and work out what are the kind of key recipe for success among sort of different sorts of insects. And that's kind of like the running theme through the book. They're also incredibly abundant, as I'm sure you sometimes notice. So it's hard to know, how abundant insects are, how many of them they are as individuals, but people have tried. This is a figure that's quoted quite often, that on the planet at any one time there are 10 quadrillion insects alive. I don't know how they arrived at that figure. It's obviously a very, very rough approximate guess, but all it does is show you that there are a lot of individuals as well as a great diversity. And so within the book, what I wanted to do was to explore why they are as diverse and abundant as they are. And here's just a couple of the topics, just to give you a kind of flavor. One is that insects are built the opposite way around to us. We have our skeleton on the inside and we hang all our soft bits off it on the outside. Insects have a hard skeleton on the outside and all their soft bits are protected inside. So they have this kind of suit of armor made of stuff called chitin. But the point is that this stuff, chitin, is more like kind of plastic, in the sense that insects can shape and mold that into almost any form they want, which means they can adapt their bodies and their different body parts to all kinds of ways of making a living. Here's my favorite example. This is a lantern bug from South America, which is able, with this head part at the left hand side there is hollow, and it mimics a caiman or alligator. For example, against birds which have got their eyes on, the ones that have got their eyes on the side of the head and have got therefore monocular vision, they don't really know whether that's a caiman a little bit further away or a very small bug really close. And you can see the shape of the eye, of the caiman's eye, the mimic of the teeth. It's just one example among hundreds of thousands of examples that show the flexibility of insect design, which is obviously a key part of their success story. Insects can fly. They were the first creatures to take to the air and had the air to themselves for many tens of millions of years before the pterosaurs and birds and bats came along. But unlike all those vertebrate flying groups, insects invented their wings from scratch. So if a bird or a bat or a pterosaur wants to fly, it's had to convert its front pair of legs, and they've only had 4 to start off with. So that them into, you know, two legs basically, whereas insects, the wings evolved entirely from scratch, and insects have got six legs, and they've kept all six legs, which means they can, you know, adapt those for whatever reason they want as well. So it's another example of flexibility. And of course, being able to fly means you can get around, and it also means you can, like a lot of birds do, migrate. And this is perhaps the most famous of insect migrants, the monarch butterflies, photographs taken at El Rosario in the Sierra Madre mountains of Mexico, where they overwinter in these extraordinary massive clumps, millions upon millions of butterflies in a few acres of Oyamel firs in these Mexican mountains. Life cycles too. So when an insect egg hatches, in some insects, the thing that hatches is pretty much like a miniature version of the adult, and it just grows bigger and bigger and bigger. But among the most diverse groups of insects, they have a very different larval stage, caterpillar stage, and adult stage, like this butterfly. And this seems to be one of the really important things that has boosted those groups that we looked at early on, those big five. At least four of those big five have this kind of life cycle where they have a caterpillar type of young stage and a flying adult stage, which are so different that they need that pupal stage, which is the bit in the middle, to convert one to the other. And this seems to be one of the real key factors in promoting the evolutionary success of insects. And finally, quite a lot of insects have evolved very, very complex societies, very complex social lives. Most of us are aware of ants, bees, and wasps that are highly social. We know about termites that are highly social, but they're not the only ones. There's all kinds of insects which are less well known that have developed little insect societies. So there's just a very short glimpse of the kind of things which have promoted insect success over the last few hundred million years. I've tried to sort of pull all these together in the book in a kind of, you know, coherent story way that kind of leads you through from insect origins to where they are now, and with a little bit about insect conservation woven into it. So I'll stop the share there, and we can move on to the next section.
Oh, that was great. Those photos are amazing. Did you take all of those? I know you
Yeah,
took
yeah, yeah,
made for
yeah,
the book as well. Yeah.
yeah. Yeah, a lot of those are all photos from the book actually. So, or most of them are
Okay.
anyway.
Yeah. So not everybody knows that in addition to being an author, you're also a documentary filmmaker. And so I'm kind of wondering, what was your experience of writing and researching alien worlds compared to maybe some of your other books, or how is that different than filmmaking?
Well, it's kind of very similar in a way, actually, which is kind of why I guess I can kind of balance both together, because um, making films, natural history films, at least wildlife films, takes a lot of research, way more than you ever see on the screen, because you have to really understand the animals you're trying to go and film, really understand their life cycles, their habits, all the rest of it. And you have to work very closely with the scientists that are maybe working with them, because they're your kind of gateway into getting the behavior you want on camera. So the research phase is quite similar, although, as I say, that you are limited in what you can put into a TV documentary of an hour long. You know, I always think that an hour-long TV documentary, in terms of content, is about like a, you know, a decent magazine article, whereas obviously a book is a book. It's, you know, it's much bigger. So the research has to be a bit more detailed, and that then just depends on and how long it takes just depends on the scope of it. So Alien Worlds covered a large amount of entomology, and I wanted it to be cutting edge, up to date, you know, the very latest, which meant I had to I can't remember what the final number was, but there was probably the results of summarizing like 2,000 papers in the book. So it was a lot of work. Different books are different. So the book you mentioned, that's a decade or so old now, the Paradise Found book, is very much a historical environmental history of North America. That took even longer to research because what I was trying to do with that one was to build a picture of the natural history of America from first-hand accounts from Columbus, through Lewis and Clark, to the start of the 20th century, which meant having to read huge amounts of material because most of these people weren't really biologists, and I was just picking out the bits that gave us a clue about the natural history of the time. So it varies depending on the book, but the books usually take me maybe 2 or 3 years to research, which I'm obviously doing at the same time as I'm making TV shows, and the
Right,
research
right.
cross fertilizes. So it's not like I've got to stop making TV shows for 2 years while I research a book. It's kind of, the Planet Insect series. A lot of the research was the same as for the book, so it's kind of it's ergonomic. It works
Mhm.
out quite.
All right, so we do have a question in the chat. Carrie asks, I've been watching a wasp nest build in my yard, and why should we value wasps?
You'd be surprised how often I get that question. Well, there are a lot. It's a really good question because it opens up a whole can of worms or a whole can of wasps, I suppose. But so there's several different ways to answer that question. The first way and the kind of simplest way is that they do have a role to play in the ecology, in the sense that they're predators of other insects. They feed their larvae on mashed up caterpillars and various bugs, and a big wasp colony contains a lot of workers all out there foraging for stuff. So they are, if you want to think of it like that, they are controlling other insect populations, and they're quite efficient at doing it. They can remember where they found a really good prey item, and they'll check and see if there's any more. And I remember filming some paper wasps once in Tucson in the University of Arizona, and the researchers there, kind of for the hell of it, had trained the wasps to come at 2 o'clock every day. So they would give them like mealworms and wax moth caterpillars, which are really easy food for them. Every day at 2 o'clock, they'd put a little dish out, and the wasps had learnt this. And so we went out there at like 5 to 2, and there's no wasps. And then come 2 o'clock, tick, and these things just start turning up, waiting for their dinner. So they are incredibly efficient predators. But to answer it another way, which is kind of like a more philosophical, if you like, way to answer it, I'd almost say that it's kind of almost the wrong question to answer. It doesn't matter whether we value them or not. They have evolved. They are part of the natural world, and they are as extraordinary and amazing as any other animal. Whether they have value to us or not is in a sense irrelevant. They're part of an extraordinary story that began 4.5 billion years ago, when this planet coalesced in space, and has gone on through that whole time, changing. A skin of life that developed on it has changed and grown. And they're part of that. They're part of this enormous, grandiose picture of life, which, as far as we know, it probably isn't true, but as far as we know, is the only place in the universe that life exists. So there's a sort of deeper philosophical question that there. So that's why I say it's a really good question, because it has like multiple answers that can take you into multiple layers of how you appreciate the natural world.
And the wasp topic kind of brings me to this other question. I know for World Migratory Bird Day, when we were developing our materials for this year on our topic of protecting insects to protect birds, we have calls to actions that we'd like people to do, everything from reducing pesticides, planting native flowers. But one of the calls to actions that we wanted to really include was to talk to people about insects, to change their mind about insects. We just found that so many people see them as a nuisance, and not really like integral to a lot of things. And so I guess the question is, what is, as like somebody who's an author and a filmmaker and an educator, what's the hardest part about sparking an interest in insects to get people to
Well,
see their value?
listen, that's a really good question. It varies with audience, of course, but the thing is that that children, young children, have an innate fascination for insects, and it's us parents that beat it out of them, and they end up, like their parents, with this kind of aversion to insects. And I encounter this a lot, as you can imagine. It's you show someone an insect of any sort, and there's kind of, oh God, how can you pick that up, or how can you do that? And there's no kind of reason for that. So ways around it is, first of all, don't beat it out of our kids. And I do, some work with kids to um, keep them enthused about insects. And I'm sure a lot of the people in the Zoom room will have heard of Ed Wilson, who died a couple of years ago, but the Harvard biologist who was a great ambassador for the natural world. And he once, in a NPR interview, said, yeah, every kid has a bug period. I never grow out of mine. And I think that's kind of like a really good thing to remember. Then you can start kind of fascinating people by insects. So if you can get over the initial factor, um, and get deep enough into insects, then there are levels of fascination. So we now know, for example, that an awful lot of insects are probably sentient creatures. I know a number of scientist friends of mine will no longer routinely kill insects as part of experiments, because they're damn sure now that they feel pain, they have a basic level of consciousness. There's some work going on at the moment at Queen Mary University in London, and a friend of mine who's doing some of this in Tucson as well, that shows that insects have got the most extraordinarily good behavioral repertoire. So, like, we're all impressed by birds that can do really smart things. New Caledonian crows, for example, that can build their own tools and then use them and work out, if you put food in a jar which has got water in it and they can't quite reach it, they can drop things into the water to raise the level of the water to be able to reach what they want. This is great, and it tells you that birds are like, some of them at least are like, great apes and many other mammals. They've got really good consciousness, sentience. These experiments in London have showed that bumblebees can do the same. So there's a test that people use among, say, birds particularly, called the string pull test, where you can basically have a bird's perch, dangle a piece of string off it, and at the end of the piece of string is something tasty. And a bird like a raven will spot that, and it doesn't have to be taught how to do it. It goes, oh, a bit of string, food at the end of it. It'll pull the string up with its beak, put its foot on the string to hold it, pull the next bit of string up with its beak and hold it with its foot until it reaches the food. And this research in London shows that bumblebees can do the same. It's not quite the same experiment, but they can reach a honey pot that's hidden by pulling a piece of string to make it work. And what's more extraordinary is it takes them a while to work it out. But if a totally naive bee is allowed to watch that, then that bee can do it straight away. So it's watched its sisters doing something, and it's gone, okay, I understand that, and can do the same thing. So it's finding those levels of fascination which people didn't think insects could do, and suddenly it kind of starts to flip on its head. It's like, oh, wait a minute, those are um, quite phenomenal little creatures. They've got little lives, they've got their own little goals in life, so that can help, as can picking on what you might call poster children for insects. So butterflies, particularly butterflies and moths, are great because people who hate insects generally like butterflies. dragonflies are getting there, and I don't know about in your part of the world, but over here, dragonflies these days are called the bird watchers insects because you can pretty much watch them the same way you watch birds, through binoculars, see all this amazing behavior. And again, by introducing people to insects through the kind of slightly more attractive ones, you can kind of come in around the side and sneak up on them. So there's different ways of doing it, and we use all these techniques in making films as well to try and make people watch it. But as I said at the start, it's often really hard to get insect films commissioned because every time you're suddenly faced with this yuck factor from the commissioners, and so you have to start all over again and sort of try and persuade them. So that's it's a familiar process. But yeah, that's kind of how we try and approach it.
Yeah, so you mentioned dragonflies as being a good introductory insect for bird watchers. If if we wanted to go out and observe insects, like many bird watchers in our community travel to go see specific birds, but to get into watching insects or observing insects, like what kind of gear do you need, and where can you go? And
Well,
magnifying glass in your own backyard, or is there anything
yeah.
else?
Listen, I got I spend a lot of time in my own backyard. It's a tiny backyard too. It's we live in a Victorian terrace house with a small garden, but it's planted up with all kinds of plants that encourage insects. And I'm always finding new species in the garden. Um, so you don't have to go very far. That's the great thing about insects. I mean, there's probably 300-400 species of insects in my garden, where there's probably certainly in the middle of Bristol here, maybe a dozen species of birds. So there's a lot more diversity, a lot more challenge to working out what they are. Equipment wise, it's the same equipment really. I mean, you can uh, generally do a lot with insects with just the same pair of binoculars that you would use for bird watching. That said, the Pentax make a set of binoculars which I think it's called papilios, and they are small and not expensive. I mean, like, well, about $150, something like that for binoculars. That's pretty damn cheap. They're excellent binoculars, but they focus down to about a foot or under a foot, which means you can sit there watching insects on a flower in front of you, and it kind of magnifies the whole thing. So it's the same techniques as bird watching. It's just a lot closer, but it's also a lot more unusual because every time you do that, you see some really interesting behavior developing. And there's no way you can't go. I mean, there's insects everywhere. So it's not like you have to go to some pristine bit of woodland or whatever to try and find them. I mean, if you want to see specific ones, then and there are some of the rarer ones, you'll probably have to travel to key locations. But in general, no, you can sit and watch stuff happening everywhere, including your own backyard. And the other day I was just watching butterflies laying eggs. I planted some bushes, which are the sole food plant for a brimstone butterfly. It's a beautiful yellow butterfly, and it's probably the only bush of alder buckthorn, which is their food plant, in the whole neighborhood. But they found it, and there were females on there laying eggs the other day, and I just watched them for ages, just finding where the leaves were and laying their eggs underneath it. So yeah, you can waste whole days watching insects.
So Diane in the chat asks two questions. First, do praying mantis hatch in their adult form? And secondly, what evolutionary traits have we observed among insects in the times after the Jurassic period?
Oh, two more very good questions. So yes, praying mantids are one of the kinds of insects which hatch into like miniature versions of the adult. So some of them look a bit different. Some like mimic ants in an early stage, so they don't get eaten because things tend to avoid ants. But by and large, they pretty much look like the adults to the extent they've got 6 running legs. They've well 4 running legs, and they've got their predatory front legs, and they feed in the same way as the adults. The only thing that all these insects lack when they hatch is a pair of wings, and they they grow very slowly through each molt. The wings develop as like pads on the back, and they get bigger and bigger as the insect grows. So as to what's happened to insects since the Jurassic period, the answer is quite a lot, actually, because the one thing which really boosted the success of insects was the evolution of flowering plants. And that largely happened probably right at the end of the Jurassic, and flowering plants kind of blossomed, to use an obvious phrase, during the Cretaceous period, and then even more so after the asteroid impact at the end of the Cretaceous period that wiped out the dinosaurs. So before the Jurassic, the insects were kind of different. In earlier periods, oxygen levels were higher, so insects, a lot of them could grow much bigger. So there were dragonfly relatives, which are these days called griffin flies, that had 2.5 foot, nearly 3 foot wingspans, for example. So they're pretty mighty insects. Those all disappeared quite early on. Partly oxygen levels dropped, and partly because things like birds evolved and could eat them, basically. So they kind of ate the giant insects. But a lot of the modern groups of insects that like the ones that I showed you on that Big Five slide, like the beetles and the flies, they all kind of really got going after the Jurassic. They kind of spread and diversified during the Cretaceous, alongside flowering plants. And in fact, insects help boost the diversity of flowering plants, and flowering plants help boost the diversity of insects through pollination and being able to, insects can feed on plant leaves and stuff like that. So we can thank the flowering plants for the diversity of insects to a large extent, but we can also thank insects for the amazing flowering plants that cover our world now as well. So in short, the answer is a lot's happened to insects since the Jurassic, and really since then the kind of modern world has appeared. Before that, it was a very, well, even more alien world.
Oh, great. So Maxine asks simply, can you help me like ticks?
Well, it might be a bit harder. I mean, I suppose for one thing, I could say, if I wanted to be pedantic, that at least ticks aren't insects, but that they're
It's a good point. Yeah.
arachnid spider. But that's being churlish, because I mean they're bugs, and yeah, I mean some of them are hard, and I'm not saying that you need to sort of like every insect. I think you can admire their adaptations. I mean, their ability to take on board so much food, their ability to make sure the blood flows. They've got these extraordinary anticoagulants that they can inject to get their sort of blood flowing. Their ability to survive without feeding for sometimes years, and these are all things which biologists are looking at this, because there are lots of things that may have spin-offs in other areas, not least in human medicine, in the case of anticoagulants, for example. I'm not saying you necessarily need to like them. I'm not sure I like ticks, to be honest. Try and get rid of them if I see them, but that's excuse me. But I think you can still admire them. You can still admire the adaptations, and we can learn from them as well.
Yeah, and that might actually lead into this other question we have from Anne, who says that they teach on the trail, and it's hard to convince people the value of insects, especially mosquitoes, while they're being bitten. And so what's a good, simple response we could give people when we find them being annoyed by certain insects to make them see the value, just really simply?
Well, I guess like with mosquitoes, particularly, and yeah, I'm with you. I mean, I've done a lot of filming in Florida, and there is nowhere in the planet that I've ever encountered worse for mosquitoes than Florida. I've been driven back to the car endless
Yeah, I
times.
agree. Yeah.
Yeah. I remember we not filming insects, but we were filming American crocodile eggs hatching in Florida Bay, some time ago now. with a crocodile biologist called Frank Mazzotti, and he said they'd held a crocodile conference at University of Miami recently, and that meant researchers from all over the world turning up from tropical swamps all over the world basically, and they universally voted Florida Bay the very worst place for mosquitoes they've ever seen. So yeah, you can get some pretty tough stuff, but the mosquitoes in that kind of abundance, of course, comes back to the original introduction. Fantastic source of food for a lot of birds. A lot of the things like swifts and such like can plow through swarms of mosquitoes and get a real bellyful really quickly. So even if they're not great for us, they're great for other creatures, and they're great for other creatures that we actually want to, we do like, and we do want to help conserve. So, and that's true of all insects, whether it's swarms of flies, whatever it is, that they are so numerous that they are a fantastic food source for lots of things. But mosquitoes, again, the same as ticks. I mean, there's a lot about their biology that is intriguing. I tend not to think much about that when I'm getting badly bitten in some Florida swamp, but nevertheless, there's a lot about their biology that's intriguing for lots of different reasons. But I think with something like that, where the numbers are so great, I think you kind of look at it from the point of view of what they're doing in the ecosystem. They're supporting so much more, from other insects to to bird populations, bats and stuff as well. So they're because they're so numerous and so successful, they are really, really important.
Just connecting it to the bigger picture of the ecosystem and to ourselves in a lot of ways. Yeah. Yeah, and so Juanita asks, humans have impacted insects and their numbers have been declining, and it's been leading to a loss of a lot of birds, largely because of pesticides and poisonings. So what is the plan for saving insects? Like, what can we do immediately and long term, and what are things that we need to be supporting to save insects and
Yeah.
ultimately ourselves?
Yeah, absolutely. Ultimately, ourselves is quite right as well. It's I mean, the importance of insects can't really be understated. And I think if we get a chance towards the end, I'll read the very last section of the book, which includes a quote from Ed Wilson, who I've already mentioned, who puts it way better than I can. So we'll come back to that later. But the in terms of what we can do, well, I mean, we can all do something because we can start small. So, for example, we can all plant more plants which have nectar supply and pollen supply, because one of the big problems with monocultures in agriculture is that there are no flowers anymore. I mean, that's a massive problem around me here. And once the flowers go, the pollinators go, as we discussed from an earlier question. Flowering plants and insects are very intimately related. Um, so so just simply choosing the right plants to plant, and lots of places, garden centers, whatever, as well as various organizations will advise people on plants. So, a lot of people buy these big, lousy, flora plena, huge multiple petaled flowers, which are awful, because what's happened is, to make those, the genetics has been changed so that all the parts that normally will make pollen or nectar have been converted into petals. Looks great, but it's useless to insects, so it's pointless planting those. Where you can plant native wildflowers, it's great to do that. I mean, I have a lot of native wildflowers in my little garden, and a lot of them do attract insects, not just for nectar and pollen, but because a lot of insects feed on plant leaves, but often on very specific ones as well. I mentioned my brimstone butterflies that I'm so proud of. They really only feed on a couple of shrubs, a couple of types of shrubs, and so it's no good planting anything else, because they won't bother coming to lay their eggs on it. So that's a simple thing. Obviously, as you go up in scale, then changing the nature of agriculture can have a fantastic effect. Certainly, various organisations here, like the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds, which is our kind of, overarching National Audubon Society kind of operation, have encouraged the leaving borders around fields with lots of wild flowers growing in them, and also little islands in the middle of fields with rough vegetation or flowers in them. And this doesn't reduce the acreage of crops by that much. It's a few percent, but the impact on insects initially is huge, and therefore the impact on birds particularly. So these little islands in the fields are havens for birds here called skylarks, which are open ground nesters, but they need cover in open ground, and they've become extraordinarily rare in the last few decades. But they'll happily nest in these little natural islands left in fields. And of course, the other thing is, by leaving margins around crop fields, you encourage not just pretty insects like butterflies, but all kinds of things which, as we talked about earlier with the wasps, eat other insects. So actually, you're a farmer doing that, and this has been shown in a number of experiments, will end up paying less in pesticides because you won't need to spray the crops as much, because there's the bugs in the margins are doing a lot of the work for them, and for free as well. So I think that's that's another way of doing it. And then you've got to you can keep jumping in scale. So then you're up to huge landscape scale projects, because we've obviously going to be suffering as time goes on from climate change. That's going to change the distribution of everything, and one way to help mitigate that is to make sure that landscapes are connected, so that not just insects, birds, mammals, everything else can move with the changing climate to where the climate is right for them. So these massive wildlife corridors, the bigger the better. And like this whole Yellowstone to Yukon corridor idea, to try and connect up all those habitats for big things like grizzly bears, it can work at different scales for smaller things like insects and things as well. So so there's things we can all do, and then things that we can encourage our governments and or local organizations to do, all the way up to the big scale of stuff. And even the little things help. Even just planting a garden full of flowers will have an impact, and you will see the difference in a year or so, because insects reproduce so fast. If the conditions are right, it'll take them a year and you'll see 10 times as many insects the following year.
Oh, great. So Karen asks that she's read recently that aphids and other insects that like milkweed plants should be left alone, because research has shown that the more insects on the milkweed plant, the higher survival rate of monarchs, and is wondering if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very good point, actually. The quality of milkweed plants is critical for monarch survival, especially for the generation that needs to migrate south. So I'm sure most of your folks know that as they move north from those locations I showed you in the Sierra Madre Mountains, the butterflies they move a fair distance, 1,000 kilometers or more, stop and breed, and then the next generation moves a bit further, and maybe within 3 generations or a bit more, they're up at their northern limits in Ontario or whatever. But then the generation that hatches at the end of summer is a kind of super butterfly, and basically it doesn't develop its reproductive organs. It doesn't need them until the following year. It puts everything into storing food in fat bodies, and that has to basically get it from potentially Ontario all the way down to Mexico. So a lot of that is down to the quality of food that the caterpillars have been eating. And it has been shown, for example, that drought-stressed milkweeds are the butterflies put on 20-30% less weight if they've had caterpillars feeding on those. And that's a worry, because obviously that's going to happen as climate change progresses. We are going to find areas where plants are more drought stressed. So so I think uh, that is an issue. And yeah, I mean, milkweed hosts a whole bunch of insects anyway, but you know, if it's looking healthy and it's got a lot of insects on it, that probably means it's a healthy, you know, milkweed. Then yeah, it's worth leaving it, because the chances are that, you know, if monarchs find it as well, it'll be good for the monarchs as well.
Exactly. And so Anne would like to know, is untidy gardening helping insects as much as we all hope it is? So things like leaving the leaves on the ground in the fall.
Yeah, yeah. Someone just looking to get out of doing some work.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, yeah, it does, because um, untidy gardening leaves lots of little hideaways and nooks and crannies. I mean, insects need, by insects, I really mean like all the spiders and other stuff as well, but they all need not just food, and the right place. They need, you know, places to live. They need places to
Shelter.
hide, shelter, you know. So yeah, you know, bits of tangled vegetation, or, you know, overgrown tufts of grass or whatever. I mean, you know, I leave big piles of leaves around. I even put, you know, piles of leaves up in the autumn, and you know, piles of vegetation. If I trim off any bushes and, or, you know, get loads of sticks, I just leave those all piled to slowly rot, because they will have their own insects that feed on rotting wood anyway, but they also provide shelter for, you know, everything from ground beetles to wood lice as well. So yeah, you can't, I mean, the tidier a garden is, probably the less attractive it is to these small bugs. So if that's the excuse you're looking for to do gardening, then there you go. That's what we want.
All right. So we've got another question from Karen. Besides cicadas, do insects have interruption years like birds?
Um, well, they sort of do, because it depends really on, I mean, look, insects do depend quite a lot on the conditions over the course of the year for how well they breed. And if the conditions are good, then they they can really get going. So the classic examples would be things like desert locusts and migratory locusts, where um, they live as solitary grasshoppers basically for a lot of the time. But if the conditions are right, they know they can breed up in numbers and breed up a bit more, and then suddenly, if the density is high enough, they undergo a kind of a Jekyll and Hyde shift, if you like. They undergo a physiological shift. Um, if they keep bumping into neighbours at a certain regular, you know, interval, they'll switch from solitary phase to the migratory phase, which is the big pest phase. And at that point, they'll erupt and will, you know, start swarming, and that's when you see these huge swarms of locusts which move with the weather fronts and the wind, and devastate farms. And there's other grasshoppers that do that as well. I mean, there are also other kinds of crickets and things that will do it. Mormon crickets out west, for example, have that way of building up in numbers, a bit like cicadas. It depends on environments. I mean, with the cicadas, especially this year, with the sort of famous overlapping broods from this year, and a friend of mine has just got back from Illinois, filming the tiny area where they overlap. The the cicadas, it's locked into their genetics, so they do either 13 years or 17 years. And there's a couple of other periodic species in on the Pacific Islands which do actually even number years. They do 4 years and 8 years. But one of them's called the World Cup cicada, because it actually comes out at the same time as the UEFA World Cup is played every year. Um, there's others that do that as well. But yes, there are quite a few insects which will build up in numbers, sometimes slowly, sometimes quicker. And as I said, with the locusts, then there's a physiological switch which makes them into this, you know, eruptive species. And for similar reasons that, you know, birds sometimes do. So, you know, you sometimes, you know, if conditions are right for certain kinds of birds, like over in Scandinavia, waxwings or whatever, then they will, same as locusts, they will erupt in order to find new sources of food, new breeding areas, and it's kind of the same with locusts. So yeah, there are I mean, not huge numbers, but there are a lot of examples among insects that will do the same thing.
Yeah, great. Well, we've only got a few minutes left. There was a question earlier from Sylvie who wanted you to expand a little bit on the subtitle of the book, Why Insects' Fate Will Determine Our Future. And this might be just a good way to segue into the coda of the book, which I think kind of answers that in many
It does.
ways.
It
So
does.
maybe
Yeah.
we can wrap up by you reading the coda of your book.
Yeah.
And
Why don't we do that? It saves me
yeah,
having to. I just have to read the words then.
yeah, there you go.
So this is a kind of coda right at the end of the book, which kind of summarizes what I hope where the book went. It says, I hope after this breakneck ride through a world of a million tiny lives that you share something of the same joy I feel when I meet any of these extraordinary creatures face to face. If so, you will also share my dismay at what we are doing to their world, especially in the last few decades. Over this short period of time, well within my own experience as an entomologist, insect populations around the world have crashed in an alarming way. In some places, there were 10 times as many insects crawling, hopping, and flying about when I began my studies as there are now. This makes it feel like a very personal loss. It's utterly crazy. As we've seen throughout this book, so much of the ecology of the world, our world, depends on insects. At the end of 2021, we lost one of the greatest ambassadors for insects when Edward Wilson died. It was abundantly clear to him that our destruction of the insect world, both deliberate and accidental, was, in the end, also self-destruction. To quote, if all mankind were to disappear, the world would regenerate back to the rich state of equilibrium that existed 10,000 years ago. If insects were to vanish, the environment would collapse into chaos, end quote. Despite their importance, insects remain largely unappreciated by most people who don't think twice about squishing any bug they find. Never mind that each has its place in the complex web of life on our planet. Recent research points to the fact that insect brains, as tiny as they are, possess enough complexity to generate a basic level of consciousness. So don't just see a pesky bug in need of swatting, meet a fellow sentient being, one whose kin have been living here for at least 200 times longer than we have.
Well, thank you, Steve, and thank you everybody for joining us for Bird Book Club this month. The book is Alien Worlds. If you do not have your copy already, we have some available on environmentamericas.org on our website for sale, and it has just some incredible photos in here that Steve took, and it's just a joy to read and to look through. So thank you, Steve, and thank you everybody, and protect insects to protect birds.
Thanks,
It's been a
Steve.
great pleasure.
Okay, we'll see you all next month. Bye.
See you, folks.